Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webcast viewers. My name is Fred Mifflin, President of the Canadian Club of Toronto, and your host today. Viewers, thank you for joining us. We're proud of our club's track record of providing a forum for leading political, business, and cultural leaders to share their ideas with us and to challenge our thinking. Today's guest speaker is a perfect example. Before I formally introduce the ambassador, let me tell you about some of our upcoming events. Next Monday, May the 8th, Ontario's Minister of Education, the Honourable Mitzi Hunter, will be at our podium to speak about the province's plans for innovations in learning in 21st century classrooms. And next Friday, May the 12th, our club will present its annual Canadian of the Year Award, which recognizes those Canadians whose inspirational efforts have improved the lives of others. This year's recipient is Lifeline Syria. To order tickets or to learn more about the club, please visit our website at canadianclub.org. You can also join the conversation via Twitter and Instagram by following us at CDNCLUBTO or by using that hashtag. I want to express special thanks to today's event sponsor, RBC, represented by Anne-Louise Vahovic. Thank you very much for your generous support. I also want to acknowledge the youth and young leaders who are with us today from the University of Toronto, Department of Political Science, and Jarvis Collegiate Institute. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. And now, our guest speaker. By his own admission, Ambassador John McCallum, and I quote, has lived and breathed things Chinese for a long, long time, end quote. The former Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Minister was tapped to take on the ambassadorial role in January. It is considered rare for a sitting cabinet minister to take on such a position. Given the fluidity and tensions of current international markets and politics, his appointment is considered a sigh of relief. The appointment opened a new chapter in Ambassador McCallum's life of public service after 16 years as a member of the House of Commons. First elected in 2000, he was re-elected 5 times and represented the Markham-Thornhill riding, which has strong Chinese-Canadian population. He also served as Minister of National Defence and Minister of Veterans Affairs. It may interest you to know that before political life, Ambassador McCallum was Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the Royal Bank of Canada. He's authored or co-authored 8 books or monographs and has written on fiscal and monetary issues, comparative macroeconomics, Canada-US economic integration, and other economic issues. This background will certainly be called upon as he explores economic initiatives with China. His financial background was also an asset on Parliament Hill as well. There, he was Secretary of State for International Financial Institutions, as well as Minister of National Revenue, which, on Tax Payment Day, Ambassador, may be your least appreciated posting. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions or comments, please fill out one of the Q&A cards on your tables, and one of our staff will collect them. Ambassador McCallum, welcome back to the Canadian Club. Our podium is once again yours.
Fred.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
We'll get a picture.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, well, thank you very much, Fred, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and to my former employer for sponsoring the event. I think they can afford it. Mais c'est vraiment un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici avec vous et d'être de retour de la Chine après 5 semaines en place. And my wife and I are having a fantastic time over in China. The weather's been great. The air has been wonderful. It's been great to meet our new colleagues in the embassy and greet many visiting Canadian politicians. And also for me, spending, 6 hours a week learning Mandarin, even in Canada on this visit. So all of that is great. And I think before I begin, maybe I should just thank one person who happens to be at the head table, Michael Chan, for giving me my Chinese name. It's called my Jialiang. And he gave this to me at some election some years ago, and I didn't pay that much attention. But once I got to, well, it's important, but you know, I had to win the election. But once I got to China, people say, what a marvelous name. And I didn't know why, but then they explained. So it's my Jialiang. And my means wheat. And that's good, not just because Canada produces wheat, but also because in the early 1960s, China had a huge famine or drought, and for the first time, Canada, under John Diefenbaker, sold wheat, much to the objections of the United States. So that was a good thing to have in your name. And Jia is home or house, which is always a nice thing. And finally, Liang. Liang means honesty or transparency or anti-corruption. And I can tell you in 2017, in the China of Xi Jinping, it's very good to have anti-corruption in your name. So thank you, Michael, for that name, which is serving me well. So I say I'm having a fantastic time in China, but much more important, much more important, I think it's also a fantastic time for Canada and China to strengthen their ties. As I'll explain, Canada has much to gain from building stronger ties with China, and the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and stakeholders across the country are very keen to do just that. Now, it takes two to tango, and I also have a strong sense that the Chinese are keen to work with us as well. And since the stars will not always be aligned so positively, now is the time to seize the moment and be ambitious. Now is the time to act. And that, with the support of the government, is exactly what I am planning to do. So let me start at the beginning. Within 24 hours of arriving, I was able to present my credentials to President Xi Jinping. And my main message to him from the Prime Minister was very simple. More, more, more. Or I learned the Mandarin. Geng dua, geng dua, geng dua. In both directions, Canada wants more trade, more investment, more tourists, more students, and more exchanges in every area, from health to defense to culture to sports, and there are even more than that. More, more, more also translates into more jobs for Canadians, whether because of more Chinese tourists, more Canadian exports, or more Chinese investment in Canada. I also explained to the President in my very poor Mandarin, and some of you have heard me say this before, that my affinity to China can also be explained by the numbers 150 and 40. That my wife is 100% Chinese, my sons are 50% Chinese, and the good people of Markham who've elected me for 16 years are 40% Chinese. So that explains a certain closeness to the country. And Xi Jinping, he smiled and he said, no translation needed, so I like to think he understood what I was saying. But before going on about why more is a good thing, let me also acknowledge up front that dealing with China is a two-way street. That's because there are many issues on which China and Canada disagree. We disagree on the death penalty. We disagree on some aspects of the rule of law, and public and privately on how the Chinese government treats some human rights advocates. We have a continuing keen interest in the integrity of Hong Kong's autonomous institutions under the one country, two systems rule. And that's why the consular side of my job is critical, and also why in my first 6 weeks on the job, I spent time meeting and supporting an LGBTQ group in Shanghai, female entrepreneurs in a group working to counter domestic violence in Beijing, and a remarkable woman called Qing Tian, whose organization, Educating Girls of Rural China, has done fantastic work over many decades. Let me also take this opportunity to address head-on an issue which has generated some controversy here at home, namely Canada's decision to discuss extradition issues with China. While we are a long, long, long way away from negotiating an extradition treaty with China, we have agreed to talk about the issues that need to be addressed for China or any other country to meet our high standards. This includes things like the death penalty and the importance of high standards of evidence in court proceedings. We lose nothing by explaining our system and talking about the values we hold dear. You don't not talk just because you think the other party might not agree. In fact, more conversation is often needed in those areas where our differences are greatest. I say there are two sides of the street, so let me now go on to the other side in dealing with China. And that is to say that China is important for a number of very good reasons. First, China is the world's biggest emitter of CO2. But it's also the world's biggest investor in renewable energy, investing $103 billion in 2015. That's more than 2.5 times the amount spent by the United States. So, if Canada is serious about climate change, which we are, and if Canada is serious about selling our clean tech innovations to the world, which we are, then it would absolutely make no sense to do that without engaging China. I remember former Prime Minister Stephen Harper used to make a similar argument. And on this point, if not everything he has said, I agree with him wholeheartedly. China has 20% of the world's women and girls, and China is increasingly a player in key places like Africa, which face real challenges to women's health and education. So if we want to improve the plight of women and girls around the world, then China is a key partner. The same can be said on working with China in the area of peacekeeping. If we want to engage positively on North Korea and other regional and security issues, then once again, we need to work with China. Fentanyl is the cause of a major public health crisis in Canada, with over 1,000 deaths so far, and China is a major source of that drug. If we want to address this crisis, we must work with China. And I might say the Chinese government has been working effectively with us in this area. And last but not least, and I'll get into this in a bit more detail, if we want jobs and prosperity for Canadians, then once again, China is an essential partner. So whether we're talking about climate change, the plight of women and girls, the fentanyl crisis, key security issues, or the prosperity of Canadians, in all of these cases, China is a key partner of Canada. I'll turn now to some of the economic issues. Let me begin with tourism. I still have trouble wrapping my head around Chinese numbers. I recently visited Zhengzhou, a so-called Tier 2 or even Tier 3 city with a population of 10 million people. President Xi Jinping has said that he wants 300 million Chinese people to get involved in winter sports in the run-up to the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. And he's also said that 700 million, just register that please, 700 million Chinese people will make overseas visits in the next 5 years. Imagine if just 1% of those 700 million people were to visit Canada, or 2%, or 3%. The impact on jobs and economic activity in Canada would be very substantial. On tourism, The two governments have agreed to double tourism in 10 years, and 2018 has been named the Year of Canada-China Tourism. Over 600,000 Chinese tourists visited Canada in 2016, representing a 24% increase over 2015. But that 600,000 is only about 1/2 of 1% of all the Chinese tourists around the world. So to say there's a growth potential is an understatement. So if we work very hard to sustain that growth rate of 24%, we could achieve a doubling of tourism in a much shorter period than 10 years. This will need hard work to make sure our advertising persuades Chinese people to visit Canada rather than some other place. Government must also work with industry so that visitors have the right services and amenities to ensure they have a good trip and want to come back. We must open our 7 new visa application centers, and we must see to it that visas are processed quickly. And most important, we must make sure there are enough Canada-China flights. People don't travel on boats between Canada and China. They need airplanes. So tourism is a #1 priority for me. But there are other economic sectors that are critical. Chinese appetite for Canadian wood products is very strong, as it increasingly adopts wood products in construction to meet its own climate change and energy efficiency goals. Minister François-Philippe Champagne had a very successful trip to China last week. I'd say it was well-timed. He, along with accompanying forest industry representatives, successfully engaged key Chinese contacts in both government and the private sector. Also, as recently highlighted in a report by Dominic Barton, agri-food exports to China are a huge opportunity for Canada as China seeks to feed its 1.3 billion people with healthy, high-quality food on which Canada has a strong reputation. If we work hard, we could become one of China's top 3 suppliers, and we're now #5. China is also a huge opportunity for Canada's clean tech and environment sectors. There's already a range of success stories, and Ministers McKenna and Carr are working hard to achieve much more. Education has always been a pillar of the China-Canada relationship, with 1/3 of all international students in Canada coming from China. Institutional research and academic linkages between Canadian and Chinese universities are blossoming, but could blossom even more. Maybe you're getting the sense by now, more is what we want. Ministers Joly, Qualtrough, Philpott, and Sajjan are working to enhance Canada-China ties in the areas of culture, sports, health, and defense. Finally, e-commerce is key to expanding Canadian exports to China, especially by small and medium-sized enterprises. Traditionally, SMEs, or small companies, have not been big exporters, not even to the United States, which is right beside us, let alone to China. So I think e-commerce platforms run by Alibaba, led by Jack Ma, and others, including JD.com, are of central importance in linking SMEs to the Chinese market. Beginning with the Prime Minister, Canada has had major interactions with Jack Ma of Alibaba and also with JD.com. Actions to promote e-commerce to China by a rising number of Canadian SMEs are certainly a top priority for me, and we will have more on that in coming months. All of the activities I've just described are proceeding independently of the exploratory talks on a free trade agreement that are currently underway. No decision on next steps has yet been made, but we are working hard to ensure that any possible free trade agreement would be a win-win situation for both China and the average Canadian worker. So, I think you will agree from what I've said that we have a full agenda on the China-Canada front. I don't think the Prime Minister has assigned me to a comfortable retirement from active life. I think I am quite busy. And I also believe that to carry out this agenda is as much a matter of sorting things out here in Canada as it is a question of sorting things out in China. And that's why you may be seeing me in the not-too-distant future as I plan to return to Canada every 6 to 8 weeks. It's partly a matter of talking to government people in Ottawa. That's where I'm going tonight. But equally it's important, it's a matter of checking in with stakeholders across the country and explaining to Canadians through the media why China-Canada relations are so important to our future as a country. So that is why I'm talking to you today, and I thank you for the opportunity, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
That was great. So, Ambassador, I already have some questions, and if you have others, please give them. Actually, I've got two that are essentially...
I'm used to the Chinese media now. They're very polite and deferential, not like the ones that I'll be seeing in Ottawa tomorrow. These ones are probably in between.
It's a tough crowd.
Okay.
So I actually have two that are essentially the same. How do you leverage China to assist in the North Korean situation? You touched on it briefly. And the second one says, how does China engage more actively to bring North Korea in line and not rely on the U.S. as the world's policeman?
Okay. That's a really good question. I guess I could duck out of it by saying I'm the ambassador to China and not to Korea. But that's not my style. China has been North Korea's biggest supplier, lifeline, if you like, for decades. China has had an alliance with North Korea ever since the Korean War back in the early 1950s. But I think independently of Donald Trump, China's getting fed up with North Korea. China never wanted North Korea to get a nuclear weapon, but now they've gone ahead, and despite China's efforts to slow them down, they keep speeding up. So I think independently of the new president, China was starting to get more and more fed up with North Korea. And I think Donald Trump has had an impact to strengthen China's resolve. And I think we can all agree that it's not a good situation for the world if we have talk for years and years and years, and North Korea keeps on getting stronger in terms of its nuclear capabilities. That's not good for any of us. So I do think there's pressure on China to try to control more the North Korea government, and I think to a degree that's what they wanted to do anyway. But I also think it's a delicate balance for China, because on the one hand, they want to rein North Korea in. On the other hand, they don't really want the government to collapse, which could lead to huge numbers of refugees coming into China, and it could lead to a pro-Western Korean government on China's border. So I think China's in a delicate spot, but I think they're going to move, my own assessment is they're going to move more in the direction of trying to rein North Korea in. But that is not an easy thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Second question is a trade one. What should Canadians know about the impact of a potential free trade agreement with Canada? And the corollary is, how large is the Chinese softwood lumber market, and could it replace the U.S. with this little spat that's going on? Not so little.
Okay, those are kind of two different questions. I think, as I said in going through my list of tourism, agriculture, clean tech, forestry, there are many, many sectors in which there are huge potential gains for Canada in China, whether or not we have a free trade agreement. So I think we have an agenda to pursue those areas while the free trade situation is going on. I think in terms of free trade itself, we are continuing now the exploratory talks. We've asked for feedback, detailed feedback from all the different industry across the country, and indeed the Canadian people, before the government decides what next steps to make. But the Prime Minister has said repeatedly that if we're going to have a free trade deal, we have to make sure that it's good for the average Canadian worker. Because Canadians have been very open to our government's policy of open trade and anti-protectionism, bringing in refugees, when many countries around us were not going in that direction, if you think of Brexit and the Trump election. But at the same time, Canadians are not 100% different from people in Britain and people in the United States. So I think the government has to be quite cautious. If we're going to have a free trade deal and a free trade deal with China, those words are red flags to some people. So we have to make a very strong case for that, if indeed that is the way the government decides to go. You asked about forestry. Yeah, Minister Champagne had a great visit. He and I talked to a lot of people in the forestry sector. I think that the appetite for the Chinese, by the Chinese for our wood is strong. Our major competitor is probably Russia, but we have better practices in forest management and all of that. And the Chinese are very serious about meeting their goals for energy efficiency, and wood is efficient, it's environment friendly. This has been a long-term thing. I remember when I was in China in 2005 as Natural Resources Minister, trying to sell Canadian wood to China. So that's 12 years ago. But we've made big gains since 2005, and I think there's a good chance. A lot in China depends on whether you get it into the leader's statement, and so this would be a very good place for wood in the leader's statement, which will be coming later this year. But the other thing we need to do is make sure that the Canadian forest industry is itself serious about China. They have to be serious about engaging China, building relationships, and not just use China on and off, depending how the U.S. is going. So I think it has to be a serious commitment on both sides.
Okay, thank you. This is an interesting question. Is there perception that the steep rise in real estate prices in Vancouver and Toronto are driven by overseas buyers, namely Chinese?
Really?
How do you reconcile the legitimate resistance against speculation versus the public sentiment here, which can border on xenophobia and, I can't read the other word, but okay.
Nativism.
Yes.
Well, obviously I'm not a fan of xenophobia and nativism, but I don't know if I'll get into that. It's not that I shy away from things, but it's clearly very much a provincial issue. I think the government of British Columbia and more recently the government of Ontario have both taken actions in this area. I think there's a debate among economists as to the extent to which Chinese buyers in particular have been responsible for this. I'm sure to some degree they have been. I'm not sure it's clear to exactly what extent, but it is an issue, and the provincial governments have taken action, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. We have time for one more question, and if I didn't get to your question, I apologize. This one has to do with human rights, and it says, with a change of administration in the United States and Europe embroiled in internal crises, would Canada take the mantle of the international community's human rights champion in China? What would be the focus of your ambassadorship?
I'm slow to say that there's some Canadians who say around the world that Canada leads the world in everything. I'm quite slow to say that because I don't think we lead the world in everything. I think we do in some things. But I don't think we lead the world in human rights. But I think if you look at the different countries in China, we've been clearly, let us say, in the top 3 of pushing human rights issues in China. And we have continued to do so. And we have received some flack from the Chinese government on certain issues. But that has not stopped us. And that's why at the very beginning of my speech, I talked about those issues. So, you know, nobody should think that we just shy away from those things and all we care about is the jobs and the economy. because that other side of the job is also really important. And I think, as I said, you have to live on both sides of the streets. You have to walk and chew gum at the same time. You have to deal both with the negatives, which are important to me and to many Canadians and to our government, and with the positives of the huge opportunities that China presents. So I think you have to do both. I think we will continue to do both. I think that notwithstanding this thing about Europe being in turmoil, I'm not sure that's true. It's certainly not in every area. And we work very closely with our like-minded fellow governments in China to pursue these matters.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Ambassador McCallum, on behalf of the Canadian Club, thank you for sharing your ideas about Canada's approach to strengthening relations with China. We're confident that because of your background and experience, our relationship with the world's most populous country with huge economic potential will reap mutual benefits. As you pointed out, China has been and increasingly continues to be a major player on the world stage as a leading international trade partner. It's forging relationships with emerging markets around the world and is an important strategic partner in Asia, particularly given the military tensions that you discussed. Whether it's technology, tourism, health, trade, or education, there are many opportunities to explore. We appreciate your insights and experience and want to wish you continued success in your new role. Thank you. Let me extend another round of thanks to today's event sponsor, and with the ambassador's endorsement, Anne-Louise, we're going to be doubling the sponsorship fees. So we really appreciate that. Thank you also to MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. To learn more about the club, please visit us at canadianclub.org. Thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at another of our events in the near future. Have a wonderful afternoon.